Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote mountains of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The discovery of what became known as the Fenton case occurred during the humid summer of 1967, when a team of graduate researchers from West Virginia University were conducting an extensive cataloging project in the basement archives of the abandoned Pocahontas County Courthouse. The building, constructed in 1889 and abandoned following county reorganization in 1952, had become a repository for forgotten legal documents, land records, and miscellaneous papers spanning nearly a century of mountain justice. Among the water-damaged boxes, scattered loose papers, and deteriorating ledgers, graduate student Marcus Heilman discovered a leather-bound volume that would fundamentally change everything they thought they understood about rural Appalachian history and the capacity for human evil to flourish in isolated communities. The ledger, bound in brown leather that had somehow survived decades of moisture and neglect, contained 847 pages of careful handwritten entries documenting the daily activities, decisions, and gradual psychological destruction of a remote mountain community called Cedar Hollow. The entries span from October 1891 to September 1894, written in the precise hand of Ezekiel Hartwell, who appeared to serve as the settlement's informal record keeper and community coordinator. What made this discovery extraordinary was not merely its completeness or historical value, but the meticulous detail with which it recorded the systematic psychological manipulation and ultimate destruction of an entire pioneer settlement by a single individual, a man named Silas Fenton. Cedar Hollow no longer appears on any modern maps of West Virginia. The settlement, located in what is now the northern section of the Monongahela National Forest, was established in 1886 by individuals seeking fertile bottom land and relative isolation from the increasing industrial development affecting other parts of the region. The community consisted of 32 adult residents who had carved homesteads from the dense hardwood forest along a narrow valley created by the meandering path of Blackwater Creek. Steep ridges rising nearly 800 feet on both sides created a natural isolation that appealed to people seeking self-sufficiency, but would later prove instrumental in their destruction. The geographic isolation of Cedar Hollow was both blessing and curse. The narrow valley provided rich alluvial soil, perfect for farming, abundant fresh water from Blackwater Creek, and natural protection from the harsh winds that swept across the higher elevations during winter months. Dense forests of oak, maple, and hickory provided building materials, fuel, and game animals that supplemented agricultural production. However, this same isolation meant that the nearest established town, Durban, lay 18 treacherous miles away along mountain trails that became completely impassable during winter snow and spring flooding. Communication with the outside world was sporadic at best, with mail delivery occurring perhaps once monthly during favorable weather conditions. According to Hartwell's early entries, Cedar Hollow operated as a remarkably successful cooperative community during its first 5 years. The residents worked together to clear fields, construct buildings, and ensure everyone's survival through the challenging mountain winters. The social structure was informal but effective. Major decisions were made through collective discussion, disputes resolved through mediation by respected community members, and resources shared according to need and ability to contribute. Each person maintained individual homesteads and personal property, but larger projects like road maintenance, bridge construction, and preparation for winter were undertaken as community efforts. The 32 residents represented a diverse mix of backgrounds and skills that contributed to the settlement's initial success. Hartwell himself had been a schoolteacher in Virginia before moving to the mountains with his wife, Constance. The Drummond couple brought extensive agricultural knowledge from their previous farm in Kentucky. Jeremiah Blackstone provided essential blacksmithing skills, maintaining tools and farming equipment for the entire community. The Caldwell couple contributed carpentry expertise that proved invaluable in constructing sturdy buildings designed to withstand mountain weather. Other residents brought skills in weaving, food preservation, hunting, and livestock management that made the community largely self-sufficient. This peaceful and productive existence began to change on October 15, 1891, when a stranger arrived in Cedar Hollow claiming to be an itinerant preacher seeking a place to establish a permanent congregation. Silas Fenton appeared to be a man in his early 50s, unusually tall and gaunt, with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair that gave him an appearance of aged wisdom. His physical presence was immediately striking. He moved with deliberate precision, spoke in a soft voice that somehow commanded attention, and possessed an unsettling ability to maintain direct eye contact during conversations in ways that made people feel simultaneously examined and judged. Fenton carried few material possessions beyond a worn leather Bible, several theological texts that he claimed represented advanced religious scholarship, and a small collection of personal items that included a set of bone-handled writing instruments and what appeared to be a physician's notebook filled with detailed handwriting. He explained that he had been called by divine inspiration to establish a congregation in an isolated community where he could provide spiritual guidance without the corrupting influences of modern society. His theological knowledge appeared extensive, his familiarity with Scripture impressive, and his stated intentions aligned perfectly with the community's existing values of cooperation, moral behavior, and mutual support. Hartwell's early entries regarding Fenton are cautiously optimistic. The community had functioned without formal religious leadership since its establishment, relying instead on individual residents to provide moral guidance for themselves and others. Many had expressed interest in regular worship services and structured religious instruction, particularly for those who had limited exposure to organized religious practice. Fenton's arrival seemed to answer a genuine need, and his request to establish a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement was approved after brief discussion among community members. Fenton selected a building site approximately half a mile from the main cluster of homesteads, on a slight elevation that provided an excellent view of the entire settlement, while maintaining apparent isolation. With assistance from several community members, he constructed a modest log cabin that included living quarters and a separate room that he designated for private counseling and religious study. The construction was completed with remarkable efficiency, and Fenton demonstrated considerable skill in woodworking and basic carpentry that earned immediate respect from practical mountain people who valued competence in essential skills. Sunday worship services began in November 1891, held initially in the community's shared meeting hall, which provided the largest available indoor space during cold weather. These early gatherings were well attended and appeared to strengthen community bonds rather than disrupt them. Fenton's sermons focused on themes of cooperation, moral responsibility, and the spiritual significance of creating a righteous community in the wilderness. His theological presentations were sophisticated enough to engage educated community members, while remaining accessible to those with limited formal schooling. Most importantly, his emphasis on collective responsibility and mutual support seemed to reinforce the cooperative values that had made Cedar Hollow successful. However, subtle changes in community dynamics became apparent almost immediately after Fenton established his presence. During these early worship services, residents were encouraged to share personal struggles, concerns, and prayer requests as part of the collective worship experience. Fenton demonstrated a remarkable ability to remember every detail shared during these gatherings, including intimate personal problems, financial concerns, interpersonal conflicts, and individual fears or insecurities. This attention to personal detail initially impressed community members, who interpreted his interest as evidence of genuine pastoral care and spiritual dedication. Fenton soon began making individual visits to residents during weekday periods, ostensibly to provide personal spiritual guidance and ensure that people were adapting well to more structured religious practice. These visits typically lasted several hours and involved extensive conversation about personal dynamics, relationships, individual spiritual development, and private concerns that people might hesitate to share in public settings. Fenton's approach during these visits was patient, sympathetic, and apparently non-judgmental, creating an atmosphere where people felt comfortable sharing deeply personal information they would normally keep private. However, residents gradually began reporting that these pastoral visits often left them feeling unsettled and confused rather than comforted and spiritually strengthened. Fenton possessed an uncanny ability to reference specific details from previous conversations in ways that demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of each person's most intimate concerns. He would make subtle connections between seemingly unrelated problems, suggesting patterns of spiritual weakness or moral failing that people had not previously recognized. Most disturbingly, he began offering very specific advice about personal decisions, relationships, and lifestyle choices that went far beyond traditional pastoral counseling. The ledger documents Fenton's gradual assumption of authority within community decision-making processes during the winter of 1891-92. He began attending community meetings as an observer, initially offering occasional insights from his religious perspective on matters under discussion. His contributions were thoughtful and well-reasoned, demonstrating familiarity with both practical mountain living and broader social issues that affected rural communities. Over several months, his participation evolved from occasional commentary to regular involvement in discussions about agricultural planning, resource allocation, and conflict resolution between residents. Fenton's theological knowledge provided him with a powerful tool for influencing community decisions through religious interpretation. He possessed an extensive familiarity with biblical passages that could be applied to practically any situation, allowing him to frame his personal preferences as divine guidance rather than individual opinion. When residents considered agricultural techniques that differed from his recommendations, he could quote scripture about the dangers of pride and disobedience to divine authority. When community members questioned his suggestions about resource allocation, he referenced biblical passages about the importance of submitting to spiritual leadership and trusting in divine providence rather than human wisdom. By spring 1892, Fenton had effectively established himself as the final authority on all significant community decisions. He convinced residents that pooling their individual resources would demonstrate Christian commitment to collective welfare and mutual support. Under his guidance, people began contributing grain stores, livestock, tools, and even personal possessions to a common repository that he administered on behalf of the entire community. This centralization of resources was presented as a temporary arrangement to ensure fair distribution during the challenging transition to more intensive religious practice, but it created practical dependence that made questioning his authority increasingly difficult. The ledger reveals that Fenton's control operated primarily through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure rather than direct confrontation or physical intimidation. He created a social environment where community members began monitoring each other's adherence to his increasingly detailed and restrictive behavioral expectations. People were subtly encouraged to report on neighbors who seemed insufficiently committed to spiritual development or collective welfare. Private conversations between residents were characterized as opportunities for worldly gossip that could corrupt the spiritual purity that the community was striving to achieve through dedicated religious practice. Hartwell's entries during this period document growing concern about changes in community atmosphere, but also reveal confusion about how to address problems that seem to lack obvious solutions. Fenton had not technically violated any explicit agreements or community standards. He had simply created psychological conditions where questioning his authority felt like spiritual failure rather than legitimate concern about community governance. The ledger documents several instances where residents attempted to voice reservations about the direction of community development, only to find themselves isolated from others and pressured to publicly acknowledge their rebellious spirits and insufficient faith. The most disturbing aspect of Fenton's developing control was his systematic treatment of adult community members who displayed signs of independent thinking or potential leadership qualities. He seemed to possess an intuitive ability to identify individuals who might eventually challenge his authority, and he developed specific strategies for undermining their confidence, credibility, and social connections within the community. According to detailed entries in Hartwell's ledger, Fenton accomplished this systematic undermining through a combination of public humiliation disguised as spiritual correction, enforced sleep deprivation through mandatory late-night prayer vigils, and imposed periods of social isolation characterized as opportunities for intensive spiritual reflection and personal growth. One particularly detailed section of the ledger describes Fenton's treatment of Jeremiah Blackstone, the community's essential blacksmith who had initially questioned some of Fenton's recommendations about agricultural planning and resource allocation. Fenton identified Blackstone's professional competence and practical knowledge as potential threats to his developing authority. Since other residents naturally looked to the blacksmith for advice about tools, equipment maintenance, and practical problem-solving. Rather than direct confrontation, Fenton began requiring Blackstone to attend additional individual counseling sessions designed to address what he characterized as spiritual problems related to excessive pride in worldly skills and insufficient humility before divine authority. These special counseling sessions, which could extend for 6 or 8 hours at a time, involved repetitive recitation of specific biblical passages while Fenton observed silently from across the room. When Blackstone showed signs of fatigue, confusion, or inability to maintain concentration, Fenton would express disappointment in his lack of spiritual dedication and require the session to begin again from the beginning. The stated purpose was to help Blackstone achieve proper spiritual humility and complete surrender of worldly pride, but the practical effect was systematic exhaustion and psychological disorientation that made independent thinking increasingly difficult. The ledger documents that within approximately 3 months of this intensive spiritual counseling, Blackstone's personality and behavior had changed dramatically. The previously confident and competent tradesman became withdrawn, uncertain, and unable to make even simple decisions without first seeking Fenton's approval and guidance. Residents reported that he had developed difficulty completing familiar tasks, would sometimes stare blankly into space for extended periods, and had begun speaking in fragmented sentences that often trailed off without reaching logical conclusions. When other community members attempted to offer assistance or express concern about his obvious deterioration, Blackstone would become agitated and immediately report their interference to Fenton, apparently terrified of facing additional punishment for accepting unauthorized help or support. This systematic psychological destruction was repeated with other potential community leaders according to a pattern that became increasingly clear as Hartwell documented additional cases. Fenton seemed to possess sophisticated understanding of individual psychological vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision tailored to each person's specific weaknesses and fears. He convinced Martha Caldwell, a recent widow who was struggling with grief, that her emotional pain was evidence of insufficient faith in divine providence, requiring her to surrender her late husband's tools and possessions as proof of her spiritual commitment to moving beyond worldly attachments. He persuaded Isaac Drummond, an ambitious farmer who had been planning to expand his agricultural operations, that his desire to improve his land represented a form of spiritual greed that endangered his eternal salvation, pressuring him to abandon his development plans and accept a subsistence-level existence as evidence of proper humility. The ledger reveals that by the winter of 1892-93, Cedar Hollow had been transformed from a thriving cooperative community into a collection of psychologically shattered individuals who moved through their daily routines in mechanical silence, punctuated only by mandatory religious observances. Residents stopped engaging in the casual conversations, shared meals, recreational activities, and mutual assistance that had once formed the social foundation of their community life. Adults spoke only when necessary and always in carefully measured tones designed to avoid attracting Fenton's attention or displeasure. The spontaneous laughter, singing, storytelling, and informal gatherings that had once made Cedar Hollow a genuinely pleasant place to live had been systematically eliminated as incompatible with serious spiritual development. Hartwell's entries during this period become increasingly desperate in tone and increasingly erratic in organization, reflecting his own psychological deterioration under the constant stress of living in what he describes as a community walking through living death. He documents that people had begun experiencing serious physical symptoms related to chronic stress and fear, difficulty sleeping despite constant exhaustion, loss of appetite, even when food was available, persistent trembling that made detailed work nearly impossible, and recurring headaches that interfered with concentration and decision-making. The community's agricultural productivity had declined significantly due to these physical problems, combined with the psychological inability to plan effectively for future needs or coordinate complex cooperative projects. The situation deteriorated further when Fenton instituted what he termed spiritual purification protocols, designed to eliminate remaining traces of worldly thinking and selfish behavior. Community members were required to participate in confession sessions 3 times weekly, during which they were expected to acknowledge not only their own perceived sins and spiritual failures, but also to report on the attitudes, behaviors, and level of spiritual commitment displayed by their neighbors. These confession sessions created an atmosphere of complete mutual distrust, where residents lived in constant fear of being reported for infractions they might not even understand they had committed, while simultaneously feeling pressured to demonstrate their own spiritual development by identifying problems in others. Fenton's psychological manipulation reached its most devastating peak during the winter of 1892-93, when the community faced genuine food shortages due to reduced agricultural production and poor planning related to their deteriorated collective decision-making capabilities. Rather than organizing rational distribution of available resources or developing practical strategies for supplementing their food supply through hunting or trade with neighboring communities, Fenton declared that the scarcity represented divine punishment for the community's persistent spiritual failures and insufficient commitment to righteous living. He instituted a system where access to available food became contingent on public demonstrations of faith, spiritual insight, and absolute obedience to his guidance. Under this system, residents found themselves competing against each other for basic survival needs, completely destroying the cooperative relationships and mutual support networks that had previously sustained the settlement through natural hardships. People were forced to choose between maintaining their dignity and ensuring they received adequate nutrition. Community members began informing on each other not out of religious conviction, but from desperate fear that failure to demonstrate sufficient vigilance against spiritual weakness might result in reduced food allocations for themselves. The bonds of trust and mutual assistance that had taken years to develop were systematically destroyed within a matter of weeks. The ledger documents several instances where community members began exhibiting severe symptoms of psychological trauma that would later be recognized as characteristic responses to systematic abuse and psychological torture. People started displaying repetitive physical movements that seemed to provide comfort during stress, complete inability to make decisions about even the most basic daily activities, episodes of uncontrollable trembling that could last for hours, persistent nightmares that disrupted what little sleep they could manage, and sudden periods of dissociation where they seemed unable to recognize familiar people or surroundings. Fenton explained these obviously abnormal behaviors as evidence that individuals were wrestling with demons and worldly attachments, and therefore required even more intensive spiritual intervention and closer supervision. According to Hartwell's increasingly illegible handwriting, Fenton's intensive interventions involved prolonged isolation in a specially prepared root cellar beneath his cabin, where individuals were confined in complete darkness for periods ranging from several days to more than a week, while receiving minimal food and water. During these isolation periods, Fenton would visit periodically to provide what he characterized as intensive spiritual guidance designed to help victims achieve complete surrender of their independent will and total dependence on divine authority as interpreted through his guidance. The ledger suggests that these sessions involved sophisticated psychological techniques specifically designed to systematically break down the victim's sense of personal identity, independent judgment, and connection to reality outside of Fenton's immediate influence. People who emerged from these isolation experiences appeared to have suffered fundamental changes to their personalities and cognitive abilities that extended far beyond temporary disorientation or physical weakness from malnutrition. They often seemed incapable of functioning independently, even for basic tasks like preparing food, maintaining personal hygiene, or engaging in simple conversations. They required constant direction and reassurance for activities they had performed competently for decades, displayed extreme anxiety when separated from Fenton's immediate presence, and seemed unable to form or maintain normal social relationships with community members. Most disturbingly, they appeared to have lost the capacity to recognize their condition as abnormal, or to remember what their lives had been like before their psychological destruction. The community's descent into complete psychological and social collapse might have continued indefinitely, gradually consuming all remaining residents until nothing remained but empty cabins in a silent valley, except for the completely accidental arrival of an outside observer in March 1893. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, a physician traveling through the region to document traditional medical practices and folk remedies used in isolated mountain communities, became stranded in Cedar Hollow during a late winter storm that made travel on mountain trails impossible for several days. His medical training and outside perspective immediately allowed him to recognize obvious signs of systematic abuse, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that had become normalized within the community over the previous months. Whitmore's personal journal, discovered alongside the Hartwell Ledger in 1967, provides detailed clinical documentation of the conditions he observed during his enforced 3-day stay in Cedar Hollow. As a trained physician, he was able to recognize and document physical symptoms of chronic malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and what he described as advanced nervous exhaustion, affecting essentially all community members. More significantly, his medical knowledge allowed him to identify behavioral patterns that clearly indicated systematic psychological abuse rather than spiritual development or religious enthusiasm. Most disturbing to the visiting physician was his observation that community members seemed to have lost the capacity for independent decision-making and displayed what he termed pathological deference to Fenton's authority that extended far beyond normal respect for religious leadership. Adults who should have been competent to manage their own affairs appeared unable to choose what clothes to wear, when to eat meals, or how to organize basic daily activities without first receiving explicit permission and detailed guidance. This level of dependency was clearly abnormal and indicated deliberate destruction of normal adult psychological functioning rather than spiritual growth or religious commitment. Dr. Whitmore's presence created the first significant crack in Fenton's carefully maintained control over community information and external contact. The physician's questions about community health, nutrition, and living conditions revealed the extent to which normal life had been disrupted and basic human needs neglected. When Whitmore expressed professional concern about the obviously malnourished condition of several residents and the apparent lack of adequate medical care for treatable health problems, Fenton attempted to explain these conditions as the natural result of voluntary spiritual fasting and divine healing that made worldly medical intervention unnecessary or even counterproductive. Whitmore's medical training allowed him to recognize these explanations as dangerous delusions that were literally endangering lives rather than promoting spiritual development. More importantly, his outside perspective and professional authority gave community members their first opportunity in months to hear their situation described by someone who was not subject to Fenton's psychological influence. The physician's casual observations about normal relationships, healthy community dynamics, and appropriate religious practice revealed to residents how dramatically their situation had deteriorated from anything resembling normal human social organization. The doctor's influence extended beyond immediate medical assessment to provide community members with their first glimpse in months of how their situation appeared to educated observers from the outside world. Many residents had gradually lost the ability to remember what their lives had been like before Fenton's arrival, having become so completely adapted to constant fear, control, and surveillance that they could no longer envision alternatives to their current existence. Whitmore's presence reminded them that other ways of living existed and that their current situation was neither normal nor spiritually beneficial. More practically, Dr. Whitmore left behind medical supplies and specific written instructions for addressing the nutritional deficiencies and health problems that were affecting the entire community. These practical guidelines included recommendations for dietary improvements, basic medical treatments for common ailments, and physical care instructions that residents could implement without requiring external resources or specialized knowledge. As people began following these concrete medical recommendations, they experienced the first measurable improvements in their physical condition that they had felt in many months. The Hartwell Ledger documents that this physical recovery began to restore some measure of mental clarity and cognitive function that had been compromised by chronic malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress. As people regained basic physical strength and mental alertness, they gradually became more capable of independent thought and critical evaluation of their circumstances. This recovery of basic cognitive abilities created the foundation for the psychological awakening that would eventually lead to Fenton's downfall and the community's liberation from his control. Fenton recognized the serious threat posed by this returning independence and attempted to reassert his authority through increasingly desperate and heavy-handed measures. He declared that Dr. Whitmore's medical advice represented worldly temptation designed to distract the community from spiritual development, and he demanded that residents immediately discontinue the treatments that were clearly helping them recover their health and mental functioning. He characterized the improvement in people's physical condition as evidence of spiritual weakness rather than medical progress, suggesting that comfort and health were incompatible with serious religious commitment. When several residents hesitated to abandon medical treatments that were obviously beneficial, Fenton announced that the entire community would undergo final purification through complete fasting and continuous prayer vigils designed to eliminate all remaining traces of worldly thinking and attachment to physical comfort. This ultimatum represented a dramatic escalation from his previous methods of gradual psychological pressure to direct confrontation that demanded immediate and total submission. The extreme nature of his demands finally revealed to community members the ultimately destructive direction of his influence and the immediate danger to their survival. The ledger's final regular entries, written in Hartwell's increasingly shaky handwriting, but with returning clarity of thought and expression, describe a community awakening to the recognition that they had been systematically manipulated and abused rather than spiritually guided and developed. Residents began meeting secretly to discuss their situation and planned collective response to what they now recognized as a life-threatening crisis rather than religious leadership. The psychological hold that had seemed unbreakable just weeks earlier began to dissolve as people remembered their capacity for independent thought, mutual cooperation, and collective decision-making. The crucial realization that united the community was the recognition that Fenton's demands had become incompatible with basic survival and personal welfare. People could no longer rationalize subjecting themselves to continued psychological abuse and physical deprivation in the name of spiritual development. The immediate threat of final purification through complete fasting forced a choice between continued submission and active resistance that finally broke through the psychological paralysis that had prevented effective response to his gradually escalating control. The final confrontation occurred on April 15, 1893, when the community collectively refused to participate in Fenton's mandatory fasting ritual that would have effectively starved them into complete submission or death. According to Hartwell's detailed account, Fenton responded to this unified resistance with explosive rage that completely destroyed his carefully maintained facade of spiritual authority and pastoral concern. He threatened divine retribution, personal vengeance, and the complete destruction of anyone who dared defy his commands, revealing himself as a disturbed and potentially dangerous individual rather than the religious leader he had claimed to represent. This display of raw anger and obvious emotional instability finally allowed community members to see Fenton clearly for perhaps the first time since his arrival. The intimidating spiritual authority who had seemed to possess supernatural insight and divine connection was revealed as merely a skilled manipulator whose power depended entirely on their willingness to submit to his psychological control. Faced with unified resistance and community members who were no longer afraid to question his authority, Fenton's control evaporated completely within a matter of hours. The community formally expelled Fenton from Cedar Hollow on April 18, 1893, providing him with minimal supplies and clear directions to the nearest established town, but making it absolutely clear that he would not be permitted to remain in their territory under any circumstances. According to the ledger, Fenton departed carrying the same few possessions he had brought nearly 2 years earlier, but his demeanor had changed from confident authority to obvious defeat and bitter resentment. His final recorded words were a promise that the community would eventually pay for their betrayal in ways they could not imagine. But this threat seemed to carry little weight compared to the obvious relief felt by residents at his departure. The immediate aftermath of Fenton's expulsion proved to be nearly as challenging as his presence had been, though in completely different ways. The psychological trauma inflicted on the community had created lasting damage that extended far beyond the immediate physical effects of malnutrition, exhaustion, and systematic stress. Many community members discovered that they had difficulty trusting their own judgment or forming normal social relationships even after the immediate threat had been removed. The cooperative spirit and mutual confidence that had once sustained Cedar Hollow through natural hardships had been systematically destroyed and could not be easily restored simply through elimination of the source of abuse. Hartwell's final entries document the community's gradual recognition that their experience with Fenton had created permanent changes that would affect their ability to function as a cohesive social unit. Several residents made immediate decisions to abandon their homesteads entirely, seeking fresh starts in distant locations where they hoped to escape the psychological associations and traumatic memories connected to their mountain settlement. Even residents who initially intended to remain and rebuild their community life found themselves struggling with persistent anxiety, difficulty making collective decisions, and recurring nightmares that disrupted their sleep and emotional recovery. Those who remained in Cedar Hollow during the months following Fenton's departure faced the practical challenge of rebuilding agricultural production, community infrastructure, and social relationships that had been systematically destroyed during nearly 2 years of psychological manipulation. However, they also confronted the more fundamental problem of learning to trust each other again after months of enforced mutual surveillance and betrayal. The bonds of friendship and cooperation that had once made community projects enjoyable collaborative efforts had been replaced by habits of suspicion, fear of judgment, and reluctance to share personal thoughts or concerns that might be used against them. The ledger documents that, despite genuine efforts to restore normal community life, Cedar Hollow never recovered the spontaneous cooperation and mutual support that had characterized its early years. Residents continued to work together when necessary for survival, but the easy friendship and shared enjoyment that had once made their isolated settlement a genuinely pleasant place to live had been permanently damaged. People remained cautious about expressing opinions, sharing personal information, or engaging in the casual social interactions that create genuine community bonds rather than mere practical cooperation. By summer 1894, it had become clear that Cedar Hollow could not sustain itself as a viable community with its reduced population and damaged social relationships. Several more residents decided to abandon their homesteads and seek opportunities elsewhere, reducing the settlement's population below the critical mass necessary for effective cooperative agriculture and mutual support through mountain winters. The remaining people found themselves facing the prospect of gradual abandonment and eventual isolation that would make continued residence dangerous and impractical. Hartwell himself made the decision to abandon Cedar Hollow in September 1894, ending his detailed record-keeping with philosophical reflections on the experience and its lasting impact on everyone who had lived through Fenton's systematic destruction of their community. His final entries express profound sadness about the loss of what had once been a thriving and happy settlement, but also recognition that some forms of damage to human trust and social cooperation might be irreversible. The cabins, fields, and infrastructure that had represented years of hard work and community building were left to be gradually reclaimed by the forest. The story of Cedar Hollow and its destruction might have been completely lost to history, forgotten along with many other failed frontier settlements, except for Dr. Whitmore's determination to document and preserve what he had witnessed during his brief but crucial visit. His detailed medical report, submitted to the West Virginia State Medical Society in 1894, provides clinical validation and professional credibility for the psychological destruction described in Hartwell's personal ledger. Whitmore's scientific training and medical terminology give objective authority to accounts that might otherwise be dismissed as exaggerated memories, community hysteria, or personal grievances against an unpopular religious leader. Whitmore's professional report describes Fenton's methods as representing a sophisticated form of systematic psychological manipulation that deliberately broke down individual identity and independent thought in order to create complete dependence on external authority. The physician noted that the techniques appeared to be refined and systematic rather than improvisational, suggesting knowledge gained through extensive previous experience with psychological manipulation rather than intuitive cruelty or religious fanaticism. Whitmore concluded that Fenton possessed advanced understanding of human psychology that he had chosen to apply for deliberately destructive purposes rather than healing or spiritual guidance. The medical report also documents the long-term effects that Whitmore observed in Cedar Hollow survivors during the years following Fenton's departure. The physician maintained extensive correspondence with several former residents for more than a decade after their departure from the settlement, tracking their recovery and adjustment to life in more conventional communities. Many reported persistent difficulty with decision-making that extended far beyond their traumatic experience, chronic anxiety about potential manipulation by authority figures that affected their ability to participate in normal social institutions, and recurring episodes of depression that seemed to emerge without apparent external causes. Some individuals never fully recovered their ability to form trusting relationships or engage in cooperative activities that required sharing personal information or relying on others for support. They remained permanently hypervigilant about potential manipulation, interpreting normal social interactions as possible attempts at control or exploitation. While this psychological defensiveness protected them from future abuse, it also prevented them from accessing the social support and community connections that most people rely on for emotional well-being and practical assistance. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Whitmore's observation that Fenton's methods appeared to represent sophisticated knowledge that had been deliberately acquired and refined rather than accidental discovery of effective manipulation techniques. The systematic nature of his approach, the precision with which he identified and exploited individual psychological vulnerabilities, and the apparent familiarity with advanced psychological principles suggested that Cedar Hollow might not have been his first experiment in community destruction. This possibility raised terrifying questions about whether other isolated settlements might have suffered similar fates without leaving surviving witnesses or documentation. Efforts to trace Fenton's background and previous activities proved largely unsuccessful due to the limited record-keeping and communication networks that characterized frontier regions during the 1890s. Inquiries sent to religious institutions, educational establishments, and government offices across Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and surrounding states yielded no evidence of his ordination, previous pastoral positions, or formal training in theology or psychology. Fenton appeared to have emerged from nowhere with advanced knowledge and destructive skills, accomplished his systematic destruction of Cedar Hollow, and disappeared just as completely after his expulsion from the settlement. The only potentially relevant information came from a brief newspaper item published in a Pittsburgh paper during November 1893, describing the death of an unidentified transient who had been found in an abandoned mining camp outside the city. The deceased was described as a tall, gaunt man in his 50s who had apparently been living alone in deteriorated conditions for several weeks before succumbing to exposure and malnutrition. Local authorities found religious texts and what appeared to be detailed handwritten notes about psychological manipulation techniques among his few possessions, but these materials were considered worthless and disposed of before any systematic examination could be conducted. While this incident cannot be definitively connected to Silas Fenton, the timing, location, and description of the deceased correspond closely to what might have been expected if he had continued traveling after leaving Cedar Hollow. The presence of religious materials combined with notes about psychological manipulation would be consistent with his demonstrated interests and abilities. However, the disposal of these potentially crucial materials means that any connection remains purely speculative and cannot provide closure for questions about his background or the possibility that he had destroyed other communities. The discovery of the Hartwell Ledger and Whitmore Report in 1967 prompted renewed academic interest in the Cedar Hollow case among historians and psychologists studying early instances of systematic psychological abuse in American communities. Dr. Margaret Steinberg, who led the West Virginia University research team that uncovered the documents, immediately recognized similarities between Fenton's methods and psychological manipulation techniques that had been identified in more recent studies of cult behavior, coercive persuasion, and systematic psychological torture. Her preliminary analysis suggested that the Cedar Hollow case might represent one of the earliest thoroughly documented examples of organized psychological control in American frontier history. Dr. Steinberg's research revealed that Fenton's techniques anticipated, by several decades, the systematic manipulation methods that would later be formally identified and studied by psychologists investigating coercive persuasion, thought reform, and cult indoctrination. His intuitive understanding of psychological vulnerability, social isolation, and gradual escalation of control represented a level of sophistication that would not be formally recognized by academic psychology until the mid-20th century. This suggested either remarkable intuitive insight or extensive practical experience gained through previous experimentation with psychological manipulation in other settings. However, Dr. Steinberg's research was tragically cut short when she disappeared during a solo expedition to locate the original Cedar Hollow site in August 1968. Her colleagues at the university reported that she had become increasingly focused on finding physical evidence of the settlement and had begun making unauthorized individual trips into the remote forest areas where the community had been located, despite warnings about the dangerous terrain and potential for becoming lost in unmarked wilderness. Park rangers discovered her abandoned camping equipment near Blackwater Creek, but no trace of Dr. Steinberg herself was ever found despite extensive search efforts. The official investigation concluded that Dr. Steinberg had most likely become disoriented in the difficult mountain terrain and succumbed to exposure or injury in an area too remote for her distress signals to be detected. However, her research notes recovered from her university office revealed a growing conviction that important physical evidence about the Cedar Hollow case remained hidden at the original settlement site. Her final diary entries described detailed plans to excavate what she believed might be the foundation of Fenton's cabin, particularly the root cellar, where he had conducted his most intensive psychological manipulations of community members. Dr. Steinberg's disappearance effectively ended serious academic interest in the Cedar Hollow case. Her research materials were formally archived at the university library, but her tragic fate served as a powerful deterrent to other investigators who might have been interested in pursuing the dangerous field work necessary to locate physical evidence of the settlement. The Hartwell Ledger and Whitmore report remained accessible to researchers, but they were rarely consulted due to their association with Dr. Steinberg's mysterious disappearance and the disturbing nature of the psychological destruction they documented. The Cedar Hollow story remained buried in academic archives for nearly a decade, attracting occasional attention from historians studying frontier communities, but generating no sustained research interest or popular awareness. This situation changed dramatically in October 1969 when a group of recreational hikers exploring the Blackwater Creek area stumbled across what appeared to be the remains of old building foundations hidden beneath decades of forest growth and accumulated debris. Among the scattered stones, rotted timbers, and rusted metal fragments, they discovered a waterproof metal container that had somehow survived more than 75 years of mountain weather. The container held additional documents that had not been included in the original university archive. Personal letters written by Cedar Hollow residents during the height of Fenton's control that had never been sent to their intended recipients, private diary entries that provided intimate glimpses into the daily reality of living under systematic psychological manipulation, and, most significantly, several pages that appeared to be from Fenton's own writings, apparently hidden or abandoned when he fled the settlement. These newly discovered materials provided unprecedented insight into both the victim experience and the perpetrator's perspective during the systematic destruction of the community. The personal letters discovered in the metal container reveal the gradual loss of mental clarity and emotional stability that accompanied Fenton's psychological control. These documents, written by people who were attempting to communicate with contacts in distant locations, show thought patterns increasingly disrupted by fear, confusion, and the systematic erosion of independent judgment. The writing often becomes fragmented and incoherent, revealing minds under extreme stress attempting to explain experiences that exceeded their vocabulary and conceptual framework. One letter, written by Sarah Drummond to her sister in Kentucky but never sent, provides a heartbreaking glimpse into the personal experience of psychological manipulation. I write this letter knowing I will never send it, because I can no longer trust my own thoughts enough to know whether my words represent reality or delusion. I want to tell you that something terrible is happening here, but I cannot explain what it is because I no longer understand the difference between spiritual guidance and deliberate cruelty. Each morning I wake uncertain whether my thoughts belong to me or have been planted by someone else who understands my mind better than I do. The simplest decisions feel impossible, and I find myself waiting for permission to perform tasks I have done independently for 30 years. I fear that I am losing myself by degrees, but I cannot determine whether this loss represents spiritual growth or destruction of my soul. Another letter, apparently written by Jeremiah Blackstone but never completed, reveals the desperate attempt to warn others while struggling with compromised mental functioning. I want to warn you about something that I cannot adequately describe because I lack words for what has been done to us. There is a man here who takes pieces of your mind so gradually that you do not notice their absence until it is too late to protect yourself. I try to remember who I was before he came, but those memories feel like stories about someone else who lived in my body before I became this empty shell. If you receive word that I have disappeared or suffered harm, know that I fought to remain myself until the final moment, even though I fear that moment has already passed without my recognition. These personal documents provide confirmation of the psychological destruction documented in Hartwell's more formal ledger, but they also reveal aspects of the victim experience that had been incompletely captured in the historical record. Several letters reference periods of time that the writers could not remember, physical symptoms that defied medical explanation, and a pervasive sense that their own thoughts and emotions were no longer entirely under their control. The writers struggled to find language for experiences that exceeded normal human understanding, creating fragmentary but powerful testimony to the reality of systematic psychological manipulation. The discovery also included what appeared to be several pages from Fenton's personal writings, apparently hidden or abandoned during his hasty departure from Cedar Hollow. These documents, written in the same precise handwriting found in his theological notes, but with completely different content, reveal the calculating intelligence behind the systematic destruction of the settlement. Rather than religious inspiration or spiritual guidance, these pages demonstrate clinical detachment and scientific curiosity about the effects of psychological manipulation on human behavior and mental functioning. Fenton's notes describe specific techniques for identifying and exploiting individual psychological vulnerabilities, systematic methods for isolating potential opponents and breaking down their resistance, and detailed strategies for maintaining control over groups through carefully calibrated fear and dependence. Most chilling is his apparent view of human psychological resilience as an interesting problem to be solved rather than a quality to be respected or preserved. His writings reveal no evidence of empathy, moral concern, or genuine religious belief, but rather demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied with surgical precision for purely destructive purposes. One particularly disturbing entry in Fenton's notes reads, "The human mind demonstrates remarkable capacity for adaptation under pressure, but this very strength becomes weakness when properly understood and exploited. Subjects who gradually lose confidence in their own judgment will often voluntarily surrender their independence rather than face the terror of complete mental collapse. The essential technique involves maintaining sufficient psychological pressure to prevent recovery while avoiding damage so obvious that external intervention becomes likely." Religious framework provides excellent justification for invasive control while appearing to offer spiritual benefit rather than deliberate harm. These documents suggest that Fenton viewed Cedar Hollow primarily as an extended experiment in psychological control rather than a legitimate religious community. His writings reveal no evidence of genuine spiritual belief or pastoral concern for the welfare of his supposed congregation. Instead, they demonstrate comprehensive understanding of human psychology deliberately applied for systematic destruction of individual identity and community cooperation. The religious elements appear to have been cynically selected because they provided socially acceptable justification for the complete control he sought to establish over other people's lives. The final document recovered from the metal container was perhaps the most disturbing, a handwritten list containing names and locations of other isolated communities throughout Appalachia, with brief notes about their potential suitability for what Fenton termed extended psychological research. This list included communities in Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, with estimated travel times, population sizes, and assessments of their isolation from external contact. Next to several entries, he had written notes about optimal approach strategies and estimated completion timeframes. This list raised the terrifying possibility that Cedar Hollow represented only one documented instance of a broader pattern of systematic community destruction that Fenton had either contemplated or actually carried out. The clinical nature of his assessments and the detailed planning evident in his notes suggested extensive experience with psychological manipulation rather than spontaneous cruelty or religious fanaticism. The existence of this targeting list implied that other isolated settlements might have suffered similar fates without leaving surviving witnesses or historical documentation. Efforts to investigate the communities mentioned in Fenton's list proved largely unsuccessful due to incomplete historical records and the passage of nearly 8 decades since the events in question. However, researchers did discover scattered references to unexplained community dissolutions and mass departures from several of the listed settlements during the 1880s and early 1890s. While no definitive connections to Fenton could be established, the pattern of sudden abandonment of previously stable communities during the time period when he was apparently active suggested that Cedar Hollow might represent just the most thoroughly documented instance of a much broader campaign of systematic destruction. The psychological techniques documented in the Cedar Hollow case anticipated by decades the manipulation methods that would later be formally identified in academic studies of coercive persuasion, thought reform, and cult indoctrination. Fenton's systematic approach to breaking down individual identity and creating complete dependence on external authority represented knowledge that would not be formally recognized by psychology until the mid-20th century. This sophisticated understanding suggests either remarkable intuitive insight or extensive practical experience gained through previous experimentation with psychological manipulation in other communities or institutional settings. The Cedar Hollow case also demonstrated how isolated communities could become vulnerable to systematic abuse when normal social support networks were disrupted or systematically co-opted by manipulative authority figures. Fenton's success depended critically on preventing community members from accessing outside perspectives that might reveal the abnormal nature of their situation or provide alternative sources of information and support. The accidental arrival of Dr. Whitmore proved that even brief contact with external viewpoints could begin to break psychological holds that had seemed completely unshakable. Perhaps most significantly, the case illustrated how quickly ordinary, competent people could be transformed into victims of systematic psychological abuse when subjected to carefully applied pressure over extended time periods. The residents of Cedar Hollow were not unusually vulnerable, naive, or psychologically unstable. They were experienced pioneers who had successfully established a thriving community under challenging frontier conditions. Their eventual subjugation demonstrated that sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques could be effective against intelligent, capable individuals when applied with sufficient skill, persistence, and systematic escalation. The long-term effects documented by Dr. Whitmore in his follow-up correspondence with survivors also revealed how psychological trauma could persist and affect victims for decades after the immediate threat had been removed. Many Cedar Hollow survivors never fully recovered their ability to trust their own judgment or form normal social relationships, demonstrating that systematic psychological manipulation could create permanent disabilities that affected every aspect of the victim's subsequent life. This long-term damage often proved more devastating than any physical injuries, creating invisible wounds that never completely healed. The story of Cedar Hollow serves as a chilling historical reminder that human predators do not always rely on physical force or obvious violence to destroy their victims completely. Silas Fenton demonstrated that psychological manipulation could be equally devastating while leaving no physical evidence of abuse and creating situations where victims appeared to outside observers to be participating voluntarily in their own destruction. His methods were particularly insidious because they exploited the very human qualities that make communities strong: trust, cooperation, desire for spiritual meaning, and willingness to make personal sacrifices for collective welfare. The case also highlights the critical importance of maintaining connections to outside perspectives and support networks, particularly for isolated communities that might otherwise become vulnerable to systematic manipulation. The geographic isolation that made Cedar Hollow attractive to people seeking independence also made it possible for Fenton to control information and prevent residents from recognizing how far their situation had deteriorated from normal community relationships. When people lose access to external viewpoints and alternative sources of authority, they can become unable to evaluate their circumstances objectively or recognize gradual changes that would be obviously abnormal to outside observers. Today, the original site of Cedar Hollow lies beneath second-growth forest that has reclaimed the abandoned settlement over more than a century of natural succession. Park rangers occasionally encounter hikers who report feeling inexplicably anxious or uncomfortable while traveling through the area, describing sensations of being watched or evaluated that seem disproportionate to the peaceful woodland environment. While these reactions could easily be explained by the challenging terrain, remote location, and natural human response to isolation, some visitors have specifically mentioned persistent unease that continues even when they are certain they are alone in the forest. The metal container discovered in 1969 represented the final significant archaeological find related to the Cedar Hollow case. Despite occasional searches by amateur investigators and academic researchers, no additional physical evidence has been discovered to shed further light on Fenton's background, the possibility of other targeted communities, or the specific techniques he employed during the most intensive phases of psychological manipulation. The documents recovered from the site remain archived at West Virginia University, available to qualified researchers but rarely consulted due to their disturbing content and association with Dr. Steinberg's mysterious disappearance. The Fenton case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic psychological manipulation in American frontier history. The survival of multiple independent sources, Hartwell's detailed ledger, Dr. Whitmore's clinical report, personal letters from victims, and fragments of Fenton's own writings, provides an unusually complete picture of how an isolated community could be systematically destroyed through psychological rather than physical violence. The case demonstrates that extraordinary evil often presents itself not as obvious brutality or dramatic confrontation, but as legitimate authority that gradually expands its control until resistance becomes psychologically impossible. The methods Fenton employed were remarkable for their sophistication and systematic effectiveness. He understood that direct confrontation would trigger immediate resistance, so he established his control through seemingly reasonable requests that slowly escalated into total domination of every aspect of community life. He recognized that people could be manipulated more effectively through their desire to be morally good than through their fears of punishment or physical harm. By framing his demands as spiritual requirements and divine commands, he made opposition appear to represent moral failure rather than legitimate self-defense against psychological abuse. Most disturbing was Fenton's apparent understanding that psychological manipulation could be more completely destructive than physical violence because it attacked the victim's capacity for independent thought and self-protection. His victims did not simply suffer harm. They gradually lost the ability to recognize harm or protect themselves from continued abuse. They became willing participants in their own psychological destruction, unable to distinguish between their original thoughts and the beliefs systematically imposed by their manipulator through months of careful pressure and systematic erosion of mental independence. The Cedar Hollow case reminds us that human predators are often most dangerous precisely when they appear most legitimate and socially acceptable. Fenton did not announce himself as a threat. He presented himself as a spiritual leader offering guidance, community support, and religious meaning to people seeking those very benefits. His victims were destroyed not despite their virtues and positive qualities, but specifically because of them. Their desire to be faithful, cooperative, morally upright, and spiritually developed became psychological weapons systematically used against them by someone who understood exactly how to exploit basic human decency for destructive purposes. The story also illustrates how quickly normal social relationships and community bonds can deteriorate when fear and suspicion replace trust and mutual support as organizing principles. Under Fenton's systematic influence, neighbors became informants, cooperation became competition for survival resources. The social bonds that had once sustained Cedar Hollow through natural hardships were systematically destroyed and replaced with relationships based on mutual suspicion, constant anxiety, and terror of punishment for perceived spiritual failures. Perhaps most tragically, the case demonstrates how psychological trauma can continue to affect victims for decades after the immediate source of abuse has been removed. Even after Fenton was expelled and could no longer directly harm anyone, his victims continued to suffer from the psychological damage he had systematically inflicted over nearly 2 years of intensive manipulation. Many never recovered the confidence, independence, and social trust that had once defined their personalities, living permanently diminished lives as a result of their encounter with calculated psychological destruction. The documents preserved in university archives stand as enduring testimony to both human evil and human resilience. While Fenton succeeded in destroying the Cedar Hollow community and causing lasting psychological damage to its residents, he did not succeed in permanently silencing the voices of his victims or preventing their experiences from being documented and preserved. Their written accounts survive as warnings about the subtle forms that systematic abuse can take, and as evidence that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques can ultimately be recognized, resisted, and overcome through collective action and mutual support. The story of Cedar Hollow ends not with justice, resolution, or satisfying closure, but with the quiet dissolution of a community that never fully healed from its encounter with systematic psychological evil. The residents scattered to distant locations, carrying their trauma with them and rarely speaking openly about their experiences due to shame, confusion, and fear that their accounts would not be believed. The settlement itself was gradually reclaimed by natural forest growth, leaving few physical traces of what had once been a thriving pioneer community with a bright future. Yet, the written record endures, carefully preserved in climate-controlled archives and occasionally discovered by researchers seeking to understand the darker potentials of human behavior and social organization. These documents serve as sobering reminders that psychological manipulation represents a form of violence that can be as devastating as any physical assault, and that communities must maintain vigilance against those who would exploit trust, authority, and spiritual yearning for purely destructive purposes. The case of Silas Fenton and the systematic destruction of Cedar Hollow represents far more than historical curiosity or academic interest in frontier community development. It stands as a permanent warning about the vulnerability of isolated groups to systematic psychological abuse and the importance of maintaining connections to external support networks and alternative sources of information in an era when social isolation and dependence on single sources of authority have become increasingly common. The techniques Fenton employed remain disturbingly relevant to contemporary concerns about manipulation, control, and the exploitation of human psychological vulnerabilities. The story serves as a reminder that extraordinary evil often succeeds not through dramatic violence or obvious criminality, but through patient erosion of the psychological and social foundations that allow people to maintain their independence, critical thinking, and essential humanity. The residents of Cedar Hollow were defeated not in a single moment of crisis, but through countless small surrenders that seemed reasonable at the time, but ultimately led to complete psychological subjugation and the destruction of everything they had worked to build together. Their experience provides a sobering testament to the importance of maintaining diverse perspectives, questioning authority when it demands excessive control, and preserving social connections that can provide alternative viewpoints and reality checks when individual judgment becomes compromised. The psychological techniques that destroyed Cedar Hollow continue to be employed by those seeking to exploit and control others, making the documentation of this historical case directly relevant to understanding and preventing similar patterns of abuse in contemporary contexts. The archives remain open to researchers, the metal container sits in its climate-controlled storage, and the forest continues to grow over the site where 32 people once learned the terrible lesson that trust, when misplaced, can become a weapon more devastating than any physical force. The voices preserved in their letters and ledgers continue to whisper their warnings across more than a century of time, reminding us that some forms of human evil are patient enough to destroy their victims one quiet day at a time.